what we're seeing across the region is number one, a struggle for the future of the existence of independent media itself.
Hi, you're listening to State of Southasia, a podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to some of the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Nayantara. On World Press Freedom Day on May 3rd, the International Federation of Journalists released its 22nd annual South Asia Press Freedom Report. The report, titled Artificial Independence: The Fight to Save Media and Democracy, explores the interactions between democracy, media economies, and fundamental freedoms of the press across South Asia in the period between May 1st, 2023 to April 30th, 2024. In this episode, we dive into the findings with Laxmi Murthy, veteran journalist and editor of the report. First, here's a snippet from the report. On the big question of what the media in South Asia comprises of today, the report says, and I quote, "Paid content masquerading as reportage, social media posts masquerading as real news, journalism decried as fake news, press freedom as window dressing, with media blackouts on issues like enforced disappearances and struggle for self-determination, social media blockades, laws weaponized against journalists, troll armies attacking journalists on social media, with women particularly targeted, journalists self-censoring or leaving the profession, media outlets facing financial crises, corporations buying up media houses, journalists sent out to report with little or no training or editorial oversight, citizen journalists bearing witness without context or verification, partisan journalists and social media users at loggerheads. Amidst this chaos, journalistic values, ethics, and responsibility have never been as critically needed as they are today, globally and specifically in South Asia. Viability and sustainability of the media are closely linked to the public's trusts and credibility of news. A prerequisite of viability is an economic and political environment that enables independent media to function. Such conditions are lacking in most part of South Asia." End quote. Laxmi is here to talk about the finer points of this report and also about what this state of press freedoms means for democracy at a time when so many countries are conducting elections. We're recording this on the 2nd of June as India waits for the verdict in its general election. Laxmi, thank you so much for joining us today. So the little part that I read out from the report shows that things are quite dire in South Asia when it comes to the state of press freedom. What to you are the most important findings in the report that reflect the state of press freedom in South Asia?
Hi, Nayantara, and thanks, first of all, for doing this. I think it's really at a critical time that this report was brought out. Like you mentioned, election time and fight to save democracy and the media, because we're seeing similar trends across the region. There are variations, of course, but more or less what we're seeing across the region is number one, a struggle for the future of the existence of independent media itself. Amid crackdowns by the state, there's the use of physical force in many countries in the region. The police have used excessive force and excessive coercive measures against journalists in almost every country in the region. Apart from physical force, there has been the weaponizing of law, existing laws, as well as amending laws to make them even more stringent and violating democratic rights in the process. Specific laws designed to control the media, particularly the digital media and social media, these being the sites for the most free expression of dissent and questioning. Another trend we're seeing across the region is the political polarization of the media. And this political polarization is also linked to a lack of trust and credibility in the media. The autonomy of the media, which has been called the fourth estate, pillar of democracy, and so on, is a very shaky pillar for the most part. And linked with all of this is a violation of journalists' rights on a daily basis when it comes to safety and security, as well as job security and sustainability of the media as a whole. And we see all of this as interlinked. The sustainability question, job security question is very much linked with press freedom.
And, I'll just read out bits from the report that give specific examples of some of the things that you mentioned. But I just like to, look back on a few years and specifically the change that has happened over the pandemic. So, before COVID hit, in countries like India and Bangladesh, there were already clampdowns on journalists, including restricting access to information, even persecution and arrests. And then COVID came, and in the economic distress that the pandemic set off, several journalists lost jobs and newsrooms shrank. In Afghanistan, we saw a little bit of the reverse, where the big change came after COVID had already caused layoffs. And then the Taliban returns in August 2021 and press freedom all but disappears. Across the region, the pandemic has had a long tail in the way that it's affected journalists, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right. I think it was almost crisis situation snowballing into another crisis for most countries in the region. The COVID pandemic itself saw a lot of loss of lives, even among journalists who were on the front line reporting without safety equipment, without knowledge really of what, the virus was all about. We saw the deaths of several hundred journalists while reporting COVID. There was a lack of health insurance, a lack of any benefits. Their families are in pretty bad shape even now. It's been unions or other organizations that have tried to step in rather than the media houses themselves. So that insecurity continues and, in fact, has got magnified. And most newsrooms have not returned to pre COVID levels. So there's a lot of stress on health and mental health issues when short staffed newsrooms are under so much of pressure to perform. And we also see that the retrenchment has not been retraced. So there is a replacement of human, personnel, journalists or desk staff, reporters, camera persons by AI. And this is something, again, that we're just beginning to grapple with because there have been so many other crises to deal with. But the way in which artificial intelligence is creeping into the newsrooms in some places, flooding newsrooms in others, what is it doing to the ecosystem? And this soon after COVID and the lockdown has had a pretty much a sort of devastating effect simply because one has not had the time to sit and engage with what really the impacts are going to be. In Afghanistan, like you mentioned, soon after COVID came the Taliban takeover. Along with it came restrictions. Just for one example, there were restrictions on airing music and entertainment programs, for example. So advertising revenue plummeted because commercial partnerships were no longer viable because readers or listeners, especially to radio programs, wanted to hear things that they were entertained by or found newsworthy, which was no longer the case. So advertising loss has led to, again, further shutdowns in the Afghan media. In Sri Lanka, also, the COVID pandemic and shutdowns were followed by the economic crisis, the effects of which we are still seeing now. So it is like a 3 to 4 to 5 period of an economic downturn, which has, simply not allowed the media industry to recover in the way that it needs to be independent. And one point I'd like to make here is that the retrenchments, of course, have been across the board, but women journalists have been more affected. This disproportionate affect has not been documented enough, but this is anecdotal that wherever there are dispensable staff, it is women. And they have largely been pushed to freelance, or many have been pushed out of journalism itself.
A couple of more examples from the report. In Nepal, according to the NGO Freedom Forum, more than 100 media outlets shut down just in 2023,
Yes.
and more than about 240 media personnel quit their jobs. Data from Bhutan, the Bhutan Media Foundation in 2023 showed continued falling newspaper circulation over the entire decade, and hundreds of journalists leaving the profession because of low wages and poor working conditions. In terms of funding, can we talk a little bit about what is happening with advertising specifically, and how maybe newer newsrooms that are particularly online are moving away from advertising and really looking to, subscriber models to keep it viable?
Yeah, advertising has always been a double-edged sword, so to speak. And it's been more so in recent years when polarization of the media is so obvious and so out there, because it is the more compliant media that attracts more advertising. They are able to stay afloat, they are able to actually expand. Whereas critical media, or even what one would call professional media, because this whole framing of media dissenting is when media is doing its job. Media's job is to question, media's job is to uncover. And when that is framed as dissent, anti national, seditious, and so on, that's when funding also begins to dry up. Because across the region, particularly in larger economies like India and Pakistan, the corporate political nexus is much, much stronger, and any critical political voices also see themselves getting squeezed commercially. We've seen the takeovers, most of them hostile takeovers of the media in India in particular. It's also happening in the other countries. So when we look at the political and corporate relationship with the media, it's not a happy one. It's no longer just advertising. It's no longer just how many column inches are you paying for. It is literally buying up media and controlling the narrative. But on the other hand, in countries, say, for example, Bangladesh, seemingly there is a boom in media. Just this year, the ministry released these figures that it had registered another over 200 online portals, almost 200 daily newspapers with online editions, and 17 private channels and online portals. So, for a smaller country like Bangladesh, this is huge. Yet, what we hear from the ground and from journalists working is that these are not viable. And oftentimes, these newer portals being set up have other agendas than the agenda of journalism or media output. So, these are also, I mean, when media becomes an industry, this is the way in which it affects content and news coverage. So, definitely, the media, autonomous journalists, autonomous media has been moving digital, which is also why we see such a clampdown on digital media across the board. It is because smaller media are moving away from corporate funding, are relying on subscription based models, on content creation in other fields, which is very clear. They call them advertorial or, brand content and so on. So it is a different model, and a model that's more difficult to control, and not for lack of trying, of course. So that is the model that we're seeing, that the smaller digital portals, the YouTubers, the independent podcasts, the smaller digital portals, these are the ones that are actually flourishing in terms of content and flourishing in terms of speaking truth to power, unlike the legacy media.
Do you see that this model is viable in the long term? Will these smaller news outlets or even just this kind of citizen journalism be able to continue this kind of work, whereas, legacy media does have staying power, which they've already established over the years that they've been in operation?
No, definitely viability is a question. I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic, but realistically speaking, yes, viability is a huge question. And they themselves are pivoting. You can see even in the 8 or 10 years that some of the, longer term digital portals have been in existence, they've tried many things. And even subscription models have not worked the way that they should have, simply because there's so much free content across the board, and paywalls and so on have not been as successful in terms of actually running newsrooms. So there's a lot of reliance also on, grants and fellowships which other people, other entities are paying for, and the portals are reproducing or publishing that content. It's great stuff. It's well researched, it's reported, it's doing stories which many of these smaller news agencies cannot pay for. The kind of reporting that's needed, the Forbidden Stories project, for example, it took months, or the Pegasus expose, it took 6, 8 months, almost a year. Some people were working on it. How can the smaller portals afford to follow stories like this? And yet, understanding the need. And in Himal, I mean, I hardly need to remind Himal of the struggles in terms of survival and the different models one has tried. Yet, I think one underestimates the need for this, which can then be translated into subscriptions. I think that's the key, because you see a lot of hits, you see a lot of shares, you see a lot of stories being read. Are these translating into subscriptions or paying for articles? Not quite. Not as much as one would have planned for. But I think this is probably the way to go to retain autonomy. And newer models are being evolved, newer strategies are being tried. And I think that is what is attracting, genuine journalism.
Absolutely. And on that note, I'm going to take the opportunity to give a quick reminder to our listeners that Himal's in-depth, independent coverage of the whole of South Asia relies on the support of listeners like you. To support our work and help us produce more podcasts like this one, you can become a patron of the magazine by clicking on the link in the episode notes or by going to our website, himalmag.com, and clicking Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters and keep up with our latest stories, podcasts, events, and more. You'll see a sign up link to our newsletters also in the episode notes. Now back to our conversation with Laxmi Murthy. Lakshmi, the threats affecting journalists. There have been many instances of raids on newsrooms, arrests of journalists, some even under anti-terrorism laws. There has been legislation passed as attempts to control the online space. In India, we had the broadcast bill, and the government even tried to set up a fact-checking unit for online content, which luckily the Supreme Court thwarted. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka have also passed laws in the name of digital security and online safety to control flows of information. How do newsrooms, particularly those that are entirely digital, deal with curbs like this?
Yeah, Bangladesh actually, it's not a new law, it's old law repackaged, so to speak. The Digital Security Act last year was sort of repackaged as the Cyber Security Act. And this came as a response to a lot of criticism, both within Bangladesh and from outside, international watchdog agencies, UN, and so on. So the amendments have not changed very much. Certain sections, more sections are now available and so on. But it really continues to be a tool to curb freedom of expression, which is its idea. And again, it is not only the Cybersecurity Act. There are a host of acts which have been used with the legacy media, and they continue to be used with the digital media. So it's not just the CSA, it is also the so-called reasonable restrictions which the Constitution of Bangladesh allows on freedom of expression. So it could be grounds of state security, friendly relations with other states, public order, decency, morality, defamation, contempt of court, so many. There are almost 50 laws that can curtail press freedom. How do you deal with it? Well, one keeps fighting and one keeps pushing the courts and one keeps trying to, stay on the right side of law to the extent possible. There is quite a degree of self-censorship, but there is also a great deal of speaking out. And the point is, even if you want to self-censor, that's what journalists in Bangladesh say. If we want to be careful about what we choose to write, we will not be writing on anything, because every single thing can attract some law or the other. So the choice to write about it is a choice then to be vulnerable to having a case on you. The problem also is that many agencies get crippled. Freelance journalists are thrown under the bus because they don't have any support while this, case onslaught goes on. But the good thing is that there is a lot of help, there's a lot of mobilization, even for individual journalists from larger networks. There is a lot of talk about it. There is a lot of, statements issued, protests, and so on and so forth. So there is that continuous clamor. And I think that is what gives hope that, it's not going to be taken lying down. In Sri Lanka, again, after 2022 and the general, the movement following the economic crisis, there have been a series of repressive laws despite large scale opposition. And that is what is interesting, that however repressive the state has got, there has been a very significant pushback. And the Online Safety Act, which was passed in January this year, in the face of vehement opposition and a whole host of petitions in court. So while there's been street protests, there's been a legal challenge, it is, the nature of the state, I guess, to impose these kind of laws. And ironically, imposing laws even like the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is supposed to protect against racial and religious hatred and abuse, but that has also been weaponized in Sri Lanka to punish blasphemy, alleged blasphemy, and to curb dissent. Fortunately, there has been a pushback, including from the courts. And I think this is what journalists in all countries in the region hope for, a strong judiciary, which would, bolster street protests and protests in other forums, using regulatory bodies, which again, in all of these countries have been steadily weakened to the point almost of being practically defunct. Yet these bodies, whether it's the Press Council or the Election Commission or National Human Rights Commissions across the board, have become more or less mouthpieces of the government, with very, very few exceptions. But again, there is no choice but to push and to kind of, insist on accountability from these institutions, like the way citizens are pushing the media also to be accountable. So all of this needs to go together. So again, no easy answer, no overnight solutions. And the pushback, though, does show a lot of optimism that the system can be pushed.
Sure. Also, this kind of lack of institutional support also applies to physical threats that journalists are facing. Just to kind of illustrate what these dangers are, the IFJ report says, for instance, in Bangladesh, 10 journalists died unnatural deaths, 2 being registered as murders, 3 suspected murders being listed as road accidents. In Pakistan witnessed the killing of 4 journalists, 2 in Punjab and 2 in Sindh, which has been dubbed as one of the most dangerous places to practice journalism in that country. In India, also, journalists have come under attack from police themselves, from vigilantes and armed gangs who have objected to their stories. Have these threats been escalating in recent years? I ask that because, sometimes we suffer from the bias of the present, where because we're in this current situation, we sometimes feel things are much worse than they were before. But does data actually show that these threats of physical violence against journalists are worse than earlier?
Not necessarily so. I think what's happening is there's more scrutiny. There is more documentation of these kind of instances. So in Bangladesh, when you quoted the 10 cases, many of them were suspected killings, although the motive was unknown. But in previous years, these 10 might not even have been noticed. A lot of accidents, road rage and so on, later turn out to be motivated killings. So I think the notion that any unnatural death could have a motive of, some revenge or silencing and so on, that has come about due to more stringent monitoring. There has been sort of slightly different pattern in the kind of physical violence. And in Pakistan, in recent years, recent as in the over the past, say, 8 to 10 years, one has witnessed a lot of collateral killing, one would call it. So, threatening journalists and then killing a member of the family or abducting a member of the family, which is again hitting at a very vulnerable spot with journalists. This sort of thing, Pakistan has documented several such cases where families, brothers, parents, children have been picked up, threatened, brutalized. So the pattern might change. And if you're doing very traditional monitoring of, killings of journalists, one might miss this. So there has been also a review of the kind of violations that are being documented The IFJ uses the UNESCO indicators of JSI, it's called Journalist Safety Indicators, which are standardized so that one can draw patterns. But there are several kinds of violations or the several kinds of curbs that do not find mention, but the IFJ has its own system of documentation where it does find mention. For example, internet shutdowns. Internet shutdowns are a very, very common tool used by governments to curb the free flow of information. That is a violation of media rights and should be documented as such. Likewise, the killings or the threatening of families of journalists should be seen as a tool to silence journalists. So another thing that's happening actually is a lot of the intimidation has moved to different spheres. So abuse online, for example, has escalated tremendously over the past decade. This was not even a thing, obviously, before the internet or before social media. But social media has become one of the most vulnerable places for journalists to be. Most of them are required to be on social media by their jobs, of course, with no extra pay or extra support or extra, oversight by their own social media companies, by their own employers. So they are getting abused, they are getting trolled, they're getting threatened, intimidated. And this takes a huge, huge toll on mental health, not only their mental health, but also of their families. So we see very prominent journalists, I know in India, male journalists, who are threatened that their wives will be raped or their daughters will be abducted and so on. So this, technological threats, and again, AI comes in a lot because there's, modulation of voice, which AI allows. So tracking down these cases, proving it in court is practically impossible and very, very difficult for journalists to spend their time doing. So these are newer emerging threats which can be life-threatening as well.
Right. You did mention the kind of gendered angle to the crisis that journalists are facing, talking about more women journalists being retrenched. We had mentioned that women journalists also face more trolling online. Again, just to take Afghanistan as an example, there are only about 700 active women journalists there right now. And even they have restrictions like having to cover their faces while appearing on television. There have been gender-based layoffs in Sri Lanka's media sector as well. Tell us more about, the difficulties that women face, particularly in the industry today.
In Afghanistan, since you mentioned that, that's the most stark example of the way in which women have been pushed out of the media. Prior to the Taliban takeover, women were extremely visible in the Afghan media. There was a lot of effort in training, in capacity building, and so on. There isn't a lot of, journalism schools and so on. So women were learning on the job. Very young women were joining the profession. It was seen as a very, high status kind of job, though low paid. But, it was a matter of pride to have a woman in your family in the media. But after 2021, this very thing became a source of threat and a source of intimidation. Families were intimidated. Keep your daughters at home, keep your sisters and wives at home. This isn't a job meant for women, and so on. Yes, of course, covering the face and also with a full veil, that has changed. That has, again, it's, going back to the past by the Taliban. The other aspects are, they're not very welcome in press conferences. Some press conferences openly keep women out. For media houses, the implication of cost implication also is there because women require a mahram, that is a male companion from the family, to accompany them to public places. So this would then, hike up the cost unless the women do it themselves. And which is again why for them journalism is really not a sustainable proposition, because they have to then hire a car, take along someone just to be able to report or even to attend a press conference, forget about field reporting. So it has been very, very difficult for women journalists in Afghanistan. But this trend is very similar across the region. Even India, where women are so visible, they're so seemingly every position in the media, the statistics are not great. There's no countrywide data, there's no reliable countrywide data, but estimates put it at less than a fourth of women in decision making positions in the media. When it comes to reporting, women are not provided the kind of support that male reporters are provided. And they are then just told not to report, not to go in volatile areas. And if they do, it's at their own risk. So, this is the kind of so called choice that women journalists are given in every region. And this is of course a global trend, but it's more exacerbated by cultural reasons and far more traditional ways of dealing with professional women. In job losses as well, there's a very gendered dimension to job losses. There is a huge gender pay gap, and this is something that a study in Pakistan by the Women's Media Forum of Pakistan, which is supported by the IFJ, found that the gender pay gap was very significant. For the same work, women were paid less. But this is again, since it is not legal, there's very little talk about it. And then, of course, the issue of sexual harassment at the workplace, which has simply not gone away despite a law, despite mechanisms to deal with it, despite Supreme Court orders saying that media houses will be in contempt if they don't follow these. I mean, any organization will be in contempt. Yet, a study done by the Network of Women in Media, of which I'm also a member, found that a very, very small percentage of media houses even had complaint mechanisms. And where complaint mechanisms existed, they were underutilized and they lacked credibility. They were mostly seen as management, devices to, dumb down the complaint. So this continues to be an issue, despite the Me Too movement. So many years ago, it's now coming on to what's it, 6, 7 years. Things have not really changed on the ground. It's just that there's a lot more talk about it, but not as much action.
Lakshmi, you're also part of the Free Speech Collective, which released a report in early May tracking press freedom violations in the first 4 months of this year. That is basically in the run up to this largest, most contentious election in India. And that report found no less than 134 violations in just that short period of time. Just take us through, what were the major findings of that report and what else it says.
Yeah, as you said, I mean, the election formed the backdrop for this report. And though we were not tracking hate speech, which is a whole different thing, hate speech and communally polarized speech by very senior leaders, right from the prime minister downwards, with impunity, formed a kind of background where the abuse of citizens, minorities, and journalists was normalized. So we need to see it in that context. So it's not just a violation, it is a violation that is normalized with impunity, for which clearly no action is taken. So we did see very little interventions from the Election Commission. The interventions were very half-hearted and they came way too late. And that again formed a sort of protective shell against those who abuse the rights of journalists. So we saw journalists, academics, YouTubers, students, others who faced arrests, attacks, threats, censorship. There were laws like the IT Act used against digital portals like the Caravan, UAPA, that's the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, being used very arbitrarily. The use of agencies like the Enforcement Directorate against those who were seen in opposition to the government, be it small portals like NewsClick or huge operations like the BBC. We also saw there was a significant amount of self-censorship due to this, because when violations are committed with impunity, there is very little hope in those left watching. And this again is one of the messages that repeatedly keeps getting made, that we can say what we want, we can do what we want and get away with it. So a pushback is what is really needed for anything to change. And that pushback itself was stymied at very many levels by the government. And the government in India has been very, all along sensitive to international criticism, and it's often brushed aside as motivated or, foreign funded and so on. But we saw in the past few months this year several examples of direct blockade of international coverage. So in April, we saw the South Asia Bureau Chief of the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, Avni Dias, who was just literally told overnight to pack her bags and leave. And she was openly told that that happened because she crossed a line. And in fact, that's what we called the report crossing the line, because there was a very clear line drawn, and those who crossed it had to face consequences. Another international journalist, Vanessa Dunac, a French journalist, was also made to leave. Her OCI card was, revoked. She's lived in India for over 2 decades. She's worked in India, but she was found to be critical of the government as well. Academics were deported from airports. For example, Nitasha Kaul, she was deported from Bangalore airport, where she was invited to Bangalore for a conference on the Constitution of India. So when she was deported, she did put it out on social media, which is when one heard about it. She did not tweet, she did not speak about it while in India, and that's the level of fear. One actually doesn't know what's going to happen if you speak out. So the other layer of impunity which we found in the report was laid by the media itself, the partisan media, the dominant media, which has been called Godi media by Ravish Kumar, the lapdog media, which again is, unfortunately seen by the larger public as the media. And mainstream, of course, needs to be unpacked. What is the mainstream media when, they don't cover the issues of mainstream India? They're covering issues of a minuscule representative population of the country, whose issues really don't matter to the larger populace. Yet they are called the mainstream media, and the struggling digital portals are actually taking up issues of, the larger number of citizens are, called names, hounded, cases put on them, and so on. So this report we brought out also to try and track what ground had been laid by the compliant media and the state for independent reporting during the elections.
Right. Of course, this has been a huge year for democracy around the world, with so many countries going to the polls. And in South Asia in particular, Maldives had their elections in October 2023. Bhutan and Bangladesh had elections in January this year, Pakistan in February. India has just, we've just finished this massive 1.5 month long election cycle, and Sri Lanka will have elections later this year. What should the role of the media be, particularly during elections? And what have we seen? How have journalists been either, how have they been prevented from doing that role, or how have they failed in doing it? And this particularly in the context of elections.
Yeah, media was expected to be, continues to be expected to be a watchdog, pressing for accountability, speaking truth to power in the sense of, we have laws, we have a constitution, we have adequate laws in all the countries in the region. And we have seen government after government with impunity flouting these laws themselves. Yet, who is calling them to power? It should be the media, it should be regulatory bodies, like I mentioned before, the Election Commission, the Human Rights Commission, Women's Commissions. But all of them have stood by. They have actively colluded or stood silent while violation after violation was being heaped on the public as well as the media, in the social media space. And the media actually, which should have been, producing on a daily basis or more than daily basis verified news, has failed. And those that were trying to do it have been prevented. They've been prevented access. As you know, in India, the government, the prime minister has never held a press conference. The only interviews are to extremely compliant, mouthpieces, which, I mean, they don't really count as interviews or press conferences. So where has the interface between the government and the media been? It's been absent. And the mainstream or the compliant media, as I'd rather call them, have not demanded that the government be answerable. That has been left to the smaller YouTubers or the digital media portals, who, for their pain, have had cases heaped upon them of defamation, of some income tax violation, and so on and so forth. So the strategy has been very, very clear that the media should be muzzled during elections. It should either be muzzled or it should play a role in pushing the government agenda. And this is something that happened even in the Maldives. While the media was relatively found to be impartial, the European Union Election Observation Mission in the Maldives noted that while media freedoms were generally respected during elections, political partisanship of media was prevalent, including in public service media, while there were some indications of information manipulation and social media. So, when public service media in India in particular is basically acting as another department of the government, is when space is actually taken up. Space is taken up which legitimately belongs to the public but is taken over by the ruling party, which then, when it is pointed out by autonomous observers, they have cases filed against them. So it is this strategy of silence or co-opt, and that has acted pretty much across the board, particularly in India. So there was another move in the Maldives. Again, the Maldives is a very interesting example because it's such a small country, yet the number of rules, the number of advisories, the number of policies to control the media, not regulate it, is phenomenal. So in March, there was an amendment proposed to by the ruling party, the MDP, to amend the General Elections Act to allow then only any reporter that was registered in the Maldives to report on the election. So this would then mean freelance journalists are excluded and foreign correspondents are excluded. So again, this distaste for any independent scrutiny, the international eye, is something that's very, very dangerous, because it's very easy then to fall into this trap of, anyone critical is anti-national and therefore deserves to be clamped down upon. Another way of curbing in Pakistan, for example, was internet shutdown. So when mobile internet services are shut down, reporters in this digital age find it very, very difficult to report and verify facts. So you're just cutting out a whole chunk of independent journalists from being able to access and verify facts. Similar things happened in Bangladesh, where there was far more physical violence right in the run up. So, opposition rallies, for example, in October, there were 16 people killed in rallies of the opposition, and more than 5,000 were injured. About 30 journalists were attacked, their equipment was broken up, their footage was deleted. And all of this happened about 4 to 5 months before the election, sending out a very, very clear message of what is permissible in the eye of the government. And this kind of messaging, when not challenged by courts or by not when it's not challenged, creates a new normal, so to speak. Again, in Bangladesh, the denial of visas to the international press during elections, same thing, same distaste for any oversight. So visas were denied to BBC, to New York Times, Bloomberg, Agence France Presse, Reuters, and so on. So Al Jazeera. So what it means is controlling the narrative and controlling such that anyone who dissents is penalized or just completely out of the picture, like in this case, the international media.
So I was just going to come to the point of then, in this atmosphere where you have large sections of the media that are extremely compliant, again, with this digital boom, you have misinformation and disinformation, and people are, getting news from so many sources, but also struggling to figure out what information they should be looking at. It's not surprising that has been an erosion of trust in the media. And so despite a section of journalists doing their best, doing very hard work to get good stories out there, public perception of the media is not so great, and they don't know what stories to trust and what not to. So that is one aspect of it. And again, in the context of elections, then, how does a voter feel empowered with information when he or she goes to the polling booth?
I think, the lack of trust in the media is so great that I don't even think people, at least in India, are looking to the media for their information. There is such distrust in the media. It is seen as a propaganda machine. So those who are part of the propaganda machine, in any case, don't need the propaganda. The others aren't going to trust it in any case. So that lack of credibility has, really, I mean, media in earlier days used to have debates on manifestos, on programs of plan of action, party spokespersons would be invited, talk shows would be, maybe not exactly a level playing field, but they weren't these slugfests like the way they are now. That's no longer the case. The talk shows and the so-called debates are no longer spaces where voters are informed or allowed to make up their own opinion and allowed to get information. This is again, then that gap is being filled in by social media. In a way good and in a way not so good, because there are no filters again, and social media is where people are turning to their own channel. So in a way this is also replicating confirmation bias, and what has been called WhatsApp University, that WhatsApp then you choose your course, you choose your degree, and you choose which channels to follow. And media is actually using, so WhatsApp channels, I don't have the data right now, but there's been a huge spurt of late, anecdotally, a Telegram channel. So these are the sort of micro channels or the ducts through which information is being shared, not so much on the larger channels that I think people watch just for entertainment practically. It's like watching, bullfights or something, because you're not getting information out of it. Where information is coming from, verified or not, is more from WhatsApp, Telegram channels, Signal channels. There are huge numbers of people running these. The parties are running it. So that's where you're getting information from. You're getting information which you want. You're not necessarily getting information that's verified or that is unbiased, so to speak. And that, I think, is the ecosystem we're living in, where it's more or less the choices out there. You choose your bias. You don't really have a chance to choose fact-checked information. The fact-check, websites and apps are working overtime. But by the time they actually verify a video, for example, of some leader saying something very outrageous or very inexplicable, by the time the fact check is done, which could even be like a couple of hours, that video has reached millions of users. So this is again the ecosystem we're operating in. I don't think one can label it as good or bad. That's the way it is. And I think one needs to analyze it more, and one needs to figure out ways in which one can maybe increase the field of verified information and not ask for government control or platform control. And the platforms also, I mean, have been playing a very I would say, strange game. Twitter also was asked, X was asked to take down posts and by the government of India. And I think India and Pakistan have the highest number of takedown requests in the world, which
Right.
it should show the kind of regulation that is wanted. And Twitter, I think, for the first time ever that I'm aware of, put out a sort of disclaimer that they don't think it violates the platform, but they were asked to put it down. So I think even the platforms are taken aback at this level of control and regulation.
Okay, so for the better part of this hour, we've been painting quite a gloomy picture. But for all
Yeah.
the many and quite formidable problems, there is still hope. As the IFJ report says, there are individuals, newsrooms, and networks of media workers pushing back to keep reporting, to find viable economic models to keep functioning. What have you seen people doing? In what ways has this pushback occurred?
Yeah, I mean, the pushback is at various levels, and IFJ, being a federation of journalist unions, has its ear on the ground in terms of union activity. And that is again one of the phenomena we've seen in the region where trade unions of all professions, all workers, and particularly the media, have been facing a lot of crunch. And recruitment in unions itself has gone down across the board with the contract system. And the gig economy, in any case, has militated against unionism. So that is one of the huge changes we see in the region, where earlier unions were the ones that pushed back on any kind of laws, any kind of, the press bill, for example, in the 80s. It was unions that pushed back on it and just did not allow it to pass. So, union strength has been affected, of course, by many, many reasons. There's also been a lot of fractures and divisiveness, political polarized unions, and so forth. But other associations and mobilizations are coming, because people are feeling the need. People are feeling the need to band together, which is why there is so much effort to do it. So in Pakistan, there is the DigiMap, which is a coalition of the digital publishers. In India, we have DigiPub. And in Nepal, also, there was a digital media society launched just last year to work towards more professionalism and sustainability. So, in most countries, we are seeing the digital portals which see the most need, being the most vulnerable and open to regulation and control, getting together to resist the laws that are coming along, to resist the arbitrary actions like raids and arrests of journalists and editors who are running digital portals. So we are seeing that kind of mobilization at that level. We are also seeing mobilization at the professional level, collaboration at the professional level, which is unprecedented in a profession where exclusives and scoops and getting ahead of the other was what made you, was what brought you ahead. In such a scenario of competitiveness, we find collaborations between digital portals. It started last year in 2023 when there were major assembly elections. We found News Laundry, the News Minute, the Wire, Scroll, and Caravan come together to analyze the election. And to be honest, that was the portal a whole lot of us were watching, because that was where you got sensible analysis, where you got real time decoding of the results, rather than these screaming matches on the other TV channels. So that was an experiment which really turned out well, and it was then continued to looking at the electoral bonds after February, when the Supreme Court declared electoral bonds illegal. And there was this whole release of data in bits and pieces. But again, News Laundry, News Minute, Scroll, and many independent journalists got together to analyze and bring out stories about one of the most important aspects of elections and free and fair elections that the country has ever seen. And that was done collaboratively. Again, they will be coming together on the 4th of June to analyze the election results in India. And they are also moving to joint subscription models, which again is an experiment which shows that there is a similar niche that they occupy, and why compete in that niche. A collaborative model might work better, cooperation might work better than competition. So these are models where we still don't know how viable it's going to be. There is no guarantee. But as of now, they are really doing all they can to make journalism credible again. And I think that is itself such a huge service. That is itself such a huge step in an otherwise very, very bleak landscape. And they're also doing a lot to file petitions. So the challenge to, laws which are going to curb and control have also been filed by these formations, both in India and Pakistan, where, the broadcast bill has been challenged in court. It is coalitions of journalists and journalist groups. I mean, quite apart from the regular, putting out statements, standing by journalists, whenever anyone is picked up, you will find coalitions of journalists coming out in support. And I think that itself, that support and solidarity is what, keeps you going in an otherwise extremely bleak and pessimistic kind of environment.
Right. Okay. So we'll leave this conversation there on that hopeful note. Laxmi, thank you so much for joining us on this podcast today. That was Laxmi Murthy speaking to Himal Southasian for the State of Southasia podcast. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. You can find many more stories on elections, the state of democracy in South Asia, and politics and culture across South Asia on our website, himalmag.com. Don't forget to catch up on our special series on the election in India called Modi's India from the Edges, with perspectives from across South Asia on what the last 10 years of Modi's BJP in power has meant for the region and what a third possible term might mean. You can also read reportage and analysis from across the region, listen to our other podcasts, and sign up for our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. We'll be back in 4 weeks with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia. Thank you for listening and see you then.